Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, as always, at the meeting of APS. It's a wonderful, wonderful organization. Let me get started. The title of my talk is Free Market Medicine versus License-Based Practice. And I'm going to start with the free market medicine portion. I bet you may be surprised to see Hippocrates under the free market medicine. Maybe you thought Dr. Smith would show up here, but Hippocrates, of course, you all know, but actually the details for many of us are kind of fuzzy. He was, he lived between the late 5th century and the beginning of the 4th century. And this is what a scholar in one of the world authorities on Hippocrates says about him. To read the works of Hippocrates, one does not have the impression that physicians were rare in the large cities of the classical era. If physicians were numerous, it was probably because it was not necessary to come from a medical family or to graduate from a reputable school in order to become established. All that was needed was an office and a sign. So Greek medicine, ancient Greek medicine, from which emerged Hippocrates and Hippocratism, was a completely free market environment. There was no licensing whatsoever. Anybody could hang a shingle. And out of this terrifying situation emerged Hippocrates and Hippocratism. Hippocratism, as you know, it's the thoughts and theory of the Hippocratic school that survived over the centuries through the writings of the Hippocratic Corpus. So we know about the Hippocratic school through this collection of 60 medical texts and treatises written over the decades of the mid-5th to 4th century in this free market environment. It's a wide-ranging texts of medical texts written probably by many authors, and in fact we don't know, we cannot attribute any particular text to Hippocrates himself, although we think of him because of for other historical sources as being the founder of that school. Hippocratism made some, 3 radical contributions, really radical. I mean, and we owe modern medicine to Hippocratism. One was the rationalization of medicine. The second is the establishment of medical ethics. And the third is the safeguards and the dissemination of medical knowledge. So the first one is rational medicine. So essentially it was a rejection of divine or magical causes of disease. In the ancient world, frequently diseases were attributed to somebody's sin or misbehavior. Sometimes perhaps for good reasons, but otherwise, oftentimes it was divine intervention was always invoked to explain epidemics, and frequently there had to be retribution to appease the gods. Hippocrates rejected all of this and other magical causes of disease. Instead, the Hippocratic school embraced real cause and effect relationships in nature. And therefore, they started studying patients, the patient and his environment, the patient and his diet, and so forth. And they elaborated the so-called humoral theory of health. Now, we have a tendency nowadays to, with our, in hindsight, to view the humoral theory of health disparagingly, thinking that it was, but it was a great advance. It was really a real advance to think of health in those terms. And what was important about it was the humoral theory of health had a holistic view of the person. The patient was considered as a whole individual, okay? And so a disease was an imbalance of humors in the body, but it was important that the patient was considered really as an individual. Now, of course, beyond the development of rational medicine, there was the establishment of medical ethics and the duty to the patient, which Hippocrates is most famously remembered for today. This is, you may be familiar with that quote from the Oath of Hippocrates. "I will use treatment to help the sick, according to my ability and judgment, but never with a view to injury and wrongdoing." So notice here, he's talking about the sick. He's not talking about mankind right? Or humanity, or the population. He's talking about a real person. And then he also says, I will use treatment to help the sick according to my ability and judgment. Right? So medical practice is not dictated by a blueprint standard, because he recognized that every single individual is, we all are different, we have different circumstances. We may be similar in some ways, and therefore there's a need to understand cause and effect in nature, but there are also particular circumstances that rule how each one of us become sick or recover our health. Another quote from the Oath, into whatsoever houses I will enter to help the sick, and I will abstain from all intentional wrongdoing and harm, especially from abusing the bodies of men or women, bond or free, meaning slave or free. Another quote from Jacques Joanna, the scholar on Hippocrates. The Hippocratic physician, whether he was called to a slave's bedside or that of a free man, made no distinction between the two. The slave for him was no less of a patient than the free man. The proof of this was that the physician observed the development of the slave's illness with the same care as that of the free man. So we know that in the Hippocratic writings, in the text of the Hippocratic Corpus, they would mention such and such, case reports, a slave in such household, and the description of the illness was done as carefully as it would be. For the description for that as if the patient were a free man or a slave. The duties to the patients are, specific, and here neither will I administer a poison to anybody, even if asked to do so. The physician is not an agent of third parties, right? And then there are specific do's and don'ts. There's, the oath takes a stance against abortion, against using the knife. We'll not go into this. There's a pledge to protect privacy, which is a real pledge. I will never divulge such holy secrets. In other words, Hippocratic medicine was steeped in the reality of the patient as an individual, a whole human being, not abstract ideals. And medicine, for the Hippocratic physician, is a personal commitment. Taking the oath is how one enters into the profession and how the profession is maintained. Unfortunately, Hippocratic medicine receded. It receded after the demise of classical Greece and the rise of the Macedonian Empire. What happened is that state subsidy to the Library of Alexandria essentially competed with the Hippocratic school. The school of Hippocrates in Kos declined once massive subsidies was put in place in Alexandria. And with this massive subsidy of funds in Alexandria, there was rise of competing theories of medicine, including the rise of empirical medicine. I will not go into this, but fortunately for us, Hippocratism was revived by Galen in the 2nd century, and then it was embraced by Christians in Byzantium and subsequently transmitted to the Latin West, where it became essentially the theory of the day throughout the medieval period, but it receded again at the dawn of the scientific period with the rise of mechanicism and the introduction of licensing laws. The first minor licensing law that we can record is in England. The Royal College of Physicians. There was a charter from the king to physicians of London. So Hippocratic medicine was free market medicine, and it was the best of the best, and we owe so much to it to this day. But you may say, well, in those days you could be free market medicine because science was so primitive. Let me give you a contrast, a stark contrast to Hippocratic medicine, and that's ancient Egyptian medicine. Egyptian medicine was actually state-run in those days. And here's a quote from a contemporaneous commentator on Egyptian medicine. The physicians draw their support from public funds and administer their treatments in accordance with a written law which was composed in ancient times by many famous physicians. If they follow the rules of this law, as they read in the sacred book, and yet are unable to save the patient, they are absolved of any charges and go unpunished. But if they go contrary to the law's prescription in any respect, they must submit to a trial with death as the penalty. My friends, this is guideline medicine circa 1st BC. It's a value-based care according to the Egyptians. Another feature of state-run Egyptian medicine, here's a quote from the historian Herodotus. About medicine, the Egyptians order it thus: each doctor for one disease and no more. The whole land is full of doctors. There are some for the eyes, for the head, and some for the teeth, and some for the belly, and there are some for diseases that have no outward signs. I suppose those were the psychiatrists, or I'm not sure. But state-run Egyptian medicine was extremely specialized. So here's the contrast, between the Hippocratic school, that was free market, where the generalists really dominate. There were essentially no specialists among the Hippocratic physician. And to give you an idea of what a practice of a Hippocratic physician would be, it would be not unlike the practice of an American physician pre-Flexner era, a family physician sort of having in his practice a dispensary of herbs and medicines, maybe a little bit of a surgical practice. There are treatises in Hippocratic medicine about orthopedic care and so forth. So really a generalist who took care of the whole person and frequently the whole family. So generalists dominate in free market medicine. It was actually very gentle. It was reputed to be gentle. The aim of the Hippocratic physician was to help nature with, restore health to the patient. So it was an aid to the natural healing tendencies of the body, because the body obviously has natural healing tendencies. And as I mentioned, it was rational. Ancient Egyptian medicine was state-run. Specialists dominate, as we just heard. It was frequently violent. We heard about the physicians, but you can imagine also the patients, frequently being done violence too. And it was science mixed with magic. So, my friends, I propose perhaps that the crisis of modern healthcare is a return to Egypt. Is your healthcare a type of Pharoahcare? I think it is. For the last 100 years, we've built a pyramid, this gigantic pyramid, on the foundation of licensing, because we were a free market medicine place, before the Flexner reforms, as you all know. So licensing was the foundation. And then on top of that, that got the ball rolling, and the edifice kept getting built on until today, with perhaps Pharoahcare at the very end. So I want to say a few words about state medical licensing. Medical licensing emerges when medical care is considered primarily a technique. Medical licensing sanctions the competence of the physician-technician through the administration of tests. So I'm a physician. How do people know that I'm a physician? I have a little card from the State Board of California that testifies that I've taken a test, and therefore I'm competent. Nothing wrong with that, but that cannot be what defines medicine and medical care. Medical licensing has emerged from the basis of a fundamental philosophical error that remains with us to this day. I won't spend too much about that, but it's an old philosophical error that pervades our worldview in general. As it applies to medicine, it's really the machine concept of the organism. It's the idea that bodies are machines. And that was proposed first at the dawn of the scientific revolution by René Descartes. And with the successes of sciences, it got bolstered and got boosted. The machine model of the body is a great model for scientific discovery and advances. I have absolutely nothing about the machine model. But the machine model cannot account for the whole of the human being, or any organism for that matter. Living organisms are not machine. Machines are not self-healing or self-directing, or in the case of human beings, free. The machine model cannot be the basis for medicine, licensed or not. Yet it's this machine model which, over the last few centuries, since the beginning of the scientific revolution, began to inform more and more our thinking and our worldview, first through the scientists and then the academics, and then we've been thinking more and more about the world in mechanical terms, and societies are thought of as in mechanical terms. We think about social engineerings, pushing and pulling and redirecting and rearranging. And a lot of this, and I can't spend more time on this, but sort of at some level informs our thinking about who we are and how we behave and what we are. And eventually it found its way in US licensing laws. US licensing laws embed the machine model in medical education. This is quite clear if you read the Flexner report itself. He's all about teaching medical students to consider the human body a machine. He's absolutely enamored with the laboratory. And in the aftermath of the Flexner report, all the medical schools that were shuttered on the basis of not having laboratories and things where we could test this machine model of the body. So this is really the foundation of the cataclysm in American medicine, which is a little bit difficult to recognize, because at the same time we've had so many incredible scientific advances. So we have a tendency to put the two and two together. We say, well, the licensing reforms were passed, and in the aftermath of that, science has continued to progress. But science was progressing before, and science does not need the state to tell us what to do and how to proceed in our medical understanding of what patients are, of what healthcare is, of what health is. These are very important questions. But in the aftermath of the Flexner report and licensing in the US, and licensing in Europe as well, and in most Western countries, because that's a trend that is not unique to the US, but is common to all Western countries, we've mechanized our approach to health, to healthcare, to patients. And I can give you a few examples of how that plays out. First of all, the medical curriculum. The medical curriculum that was adopted in the aftermath of the Flexner reform was a medical curriculum from a medical school that was really embraced this machine model. That was the Johns Hopkins University. It was brought in from Germany, from philosophers and scientists from Germany that also embraced this machine model. And you can see it as being quite reductionist. We start with the building blocks, right? We start with anatomy and biochemistry and so forth. And somehow we're supposed to understand what the whole organism is after that. But in reality, we never talk about what is health, how do we ascertain it, what is a patient, what is the role of the physician, what does it mean to be an individual, and so forth. It's just, go with this building block, analytical, reductionist mentality and develop the medical curriculum. So the medical curriculum follows this rationale of the machine model, and it's been bureaucratized by licensing. So licensing has made it such that we cannot change it, right? I mean, go try and make a change, through the commissions at the. It hasn't changed in 100 years. It's the same curriculum of 2 years of basic science and 2 years of clinical work, and there's no way out of that. So the curriculum is one way that medical licensing has really set medicine onto a bad course. And in addition, of course, you probably know the economic implications of licensing. When licensing came about in the United States, immediately in the decade that followed, medical price inflation began. And that is well documented. In the 1920s, there was a crisis, the beginning of a never-ending medical cost crisis, because medical schools were shuttered, the supply of physicians was reduced in half, and people and doctors were swayed into thinking into medicine as in very interventionist terms. So it became kind of an aggressive medicine. So medicine has become very aggressive, very specialized, because if you think of the body as a machine that's going to promote the emergence of a lot of specialties, each one working on his or her own different part of the body, it's going to be very specialized, very expensive, very anti-competitive, very political. If you think of the machine of the body as a machine and medicine as a technique, then it becomes easy to think that medicine should be regulated by oversight agencies, in terms of quality and safety, because it's a mechanical process, it's an industrial process. Medicine becomes an industrial process after the introduction of licensing. And then if you have this model of the body as a machine, then you can think that health insurance makes sense. Because just like you insure your car, you can insure your body. But again, the body and the car are very different things. We are not machines. And health is really not an insurable good. I can promise you that. And we see that play out over the decades with reform after reform, throwing the entire sink at health insurance and it causing more and more problems. So really, licensing laws have been the foundation of the problems of this pyramid that I showed earlier, and it's something we need to be cognizant of, and it's hard for us because we all have been brought up in a licensed medicine world. We are very proud of our licenses, of our accomplishments, of having finished medical school, and so forth. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with finishing medical school, and so forth. And there's nothing wrong about scientific advances, so don't be misled by what I'm saying. I'm not bad-mouthing advances in medical science. But what I want to say is that we have to take that into consideration when we think about our problems in healthcare. There's a fundamental philosophical problem about it. So we need to realize that medicine is not primarily a technique. If we think of medicine as a technique, we have what we deserve what we have. But medicine is an ethical commitment, first and foremost. It is from the commitment that the technical know-how is acquired and proper scientific advances emerge. Now, of course, I also need to say that most of us do make that commitment. There's no question that many of us go into medicine with that commitment in mind. Thank God for that. Thank God for that. But it has to be articulated and clear in our minds, and licensing really goes against that. Licensing is a detriment to our ethical commitment. It's an usurpation of our ethical commitment, because then the state says, your ethical commitment counts for nothing. I can decide who's competent and who's not competent, and you're a technician, and you can serve the desires of the state. Okay? So that's what I want to say. We should not fear competition in a free market. Hippocrates himself had to deal with all kinds of quacks and whatnot, and in a free market we may have to deal with the same, but we must lead by example. The Hippocratic school flourished despite the free market because patients were able to recognize who was truly ethically committed to their best interest and who really put their powers of reason and rationing and scientific advances at the service of the entire patient, the whole person. And then we must trust that only in a free market can we free ourselves from and find solutions to bad philosophical errors. So how to conceive of the human person remains a complex philosophical question. I'm not saying that I have the answers and so forth, but I know that the machine model doesn't work. Reductionism doesn't work, but medicine is wedded to reductionism through our licensing laws and our educational system that comes of it. It may seem daunting. I'm raising questions that may seem daunting. How do we go from here? I mean, who in their right mind would even consider medical care without licensing? And for that, I don't have any particular practical advice. I think ideas have to start, and then smart people will find ways to implement them. I'm gratified a little bit by a recent development in a Supreme Court ruling that came out last year. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's the Nifla versus Becerra case, which has to do with the Supreme Court striking out the notion of professional speech. And I won't get into it, perhaps our legal counsel will tell us more about it, but professional speech was one way that occupational licensing could be justified by the states. And with the Supreme Court striking out this idea that professional speech is exempt from the First Amendment, then that offers an opportunity, perhaps. I don't know quite yet, but at least the door opens up to recovering the free medicine from which, you know, that we deserve and that also deserves our attention and our commitment. So I think all I want to say at this point is that for now I want to raise awareness about this issue of licensing. I think it's really foundational to the problems of healthcare, and I thank you for your attention, because that's about it.